Shall we begin?
Well, I was told that our language here is English, so let me stick to it.
That is true.
First of all, let me welcome everybody here at the Russian International Affairs Council, but also those who are connected to us through internet. This is kind of anniversary that we have today, the 10th round of debates, which evolved quite significantly over last 9 or 10 years. But let me start with the lyrical digression, since it's already rather late, and just to warm up the discussion, let me tell you that there is a scene in the Lord of the Rings movie. A city is taken by orcs, and one of them is killing one of the defenders and saying, a kind of, very memorable phrase. He says, the age of man is over, the time of the orc has come. Has begun, right? Has begun. And, I think about that when I try to analyze the discourse on international relations. For years and years, I think we saw a very clear deterioration of this discourse, and our academic discussions got more and more polluted, saturated with politically loaded statements, with propaganda, with fake news, with what is called post-truth world. So one could argue that the age of reasonable discussions is over, and the time of post-truth has begun. So I thought that such events like our debates was an opportunity to keep the quality, to keep the standards of discussions, discussions of the most sensitive and most difficult issues. But today, I'd like to argue that probably the dawn is approaching. Maybe we have already hit the bottom, and I can see a very clearly defined need for real discourse, for real discussions of important national issues. The value of idea is back. And I think that the younger generation of scholars in Russia and also in the West should stand up to this challenge. I hope that our discussion will be a very small but not a significant contribution to this process. Thank you.
Great. I'd like now to pass the word over to Natalia, who'll say a couple of words about the event and our plans for the evening.
Yes, thank you very much. So, hi everyone, this is Natalia Burlinova. I'm the head of creative diplomacy. Our organization was a co-organizer of this event since the very beginning of the project, and today this is the 10th year of this project, so anniversary. We are very glad that we start a new decade with a new format and with a new generation of speakers and new generation of moderators. So Ivan and me, we were traditionally moderators of the discussion. Today we are leaving, I would say, our post, and Ivan decided to be a speaker again, as 10 years ago. And I will give the floor from the creative diplomacy side. I will give the floor to Victoria Ivanchenko later. She is an editor-in-chief of our website. And I'm very happy that we now start a very international project with the Tufts University and with the Fletcher School. thank you very much to Arik. I would like to thank him personally because he made a lot of efforts to be this project to be realized. And now I would like to present a small video about this project, which we made with our colleagues and with the experts who participated in this project before. Just 3 minutes of a small video. Unfortunately, now it's only in Russian, but maybe our speakers from the American side, I hope they can understand a lot of things in this video. So now we watch this video and then we start our debate.
Дебаты Корtunова отмечают свое десятилетие, а начиналось все в далеком 2009 году, когда группа инициативных студентов Сергея Вадимовича Корtunова решила собраться и провести проект по внешней политике, посвященный его памяти. Так появились дебаты имени Сергея Корtunова.
Сама идея дебатов была очень интересной. Ранее ничего подобного, в принципе, не было. Страна в сфере внешней политики тогда переживала очень интересный момент. У нас был период беспрецедентного потепления отношений с Западом. В общем, хотелось что-то обсудить, хотелось подискутировать, причем сделать это как можно более в таком откровенном формате, где можно было действительно высказаться обо всем наболевшем.
Сейчас это стало уже доброй традицией проводить такие дебаты в Российском совете по международным делам. Собственно, это то пространство для дискуссии, которое, на мой взгляд, очень полезно молодому поколению международников, чтобы они входили в профессию, чтобы они понимали нюансы тех предложений, которые они делают, чтобы они понимали, какие можно выдвинуть контраргументы и умели спорить друг с другом и делать это культурно. Никто не заставляет говорить какие-то приятные вещи друг другу, а наоборот, они устроены так, что нужно спорить. Да? Это тоже хорошо, по крайней мере, интересно. Как раз дебаты, они созданы для того, чтобы люди спорили, да, и проговаривали проблемы, которые... Что если мы проговаривать проблемы не будем, то они будут загоняться внутрь, рано или поздно они вылезут наружу, взорвутся и так далее.
Изначально идея дебатов заключалась в том, чтобы устроить дискуссию между условными либералами и условными консерваторами. Консерваторов представляли члены креативной дипломатии, а либералами выступали молодые натовцы. Но со временем эта идея трансформировалась в реальную масштабную дискуссию между различными молодыми специалистами по самым разным аспектам внешней политики России.
Сергей Вадимович Корtunov, как заведующий кафедрой мировой политики, очень помогал нам и в процессе нашего обучения в аспирантуре, и в решении всяческих вопросов, связанных с нашей активностью в рамках креативной дипломатии. Мы очень все ценили Сергея Вадимовича, все признавали его высокий авторитет в области международных отношений, мировой политики.
Он считал, что нужно воспитывать молодое поколение, чтобы, в общем-то, оно было равнозначно тем орлам, которые были в советской дипломатии. И, в принципе, он всегда был генератором идей, проектов и с радостью делился своими идеями.
Мы вместе и учились, и работали параллельно. У нас тоже были жаркие дискуссии относительно того, в каком направлении должна развиваться российская политика, какими методами она должна пользоваться. И поэтому в каком-то смысле мы тоже прошли через свои дебаты. Я думаю, что, конечно, ему было бы очень приятно участвовать или наблюдать за теми дискуссиями, которые сейчас в этом формате ведут наши молодые люди, в том числе и его бывшие ученики.
Мне посчастливилось принимать участие в дебатах имени Сергея Вадимовича Kortunova, за что я очень благодарна общественной организации «Креативная дипломатия», поскольку для молодых экспертов это уникальная возможность проявить себя как спикера, проявить себя как эксперта.
Было бы очень интересно, чтобы он стал международным. Это было бы чрезвычайно важно для налаживания диалога, для построения отношений в будущем, в какой-то степени исправления ситуации. И это очень важно для имиджа России.
У дебатов две цели. Первая – помочь молодым международникам выйти на публику и принять участие в дискуссии, отстаивая свою позицию, свою точку зрения. Мы открываем новые имена. А вторая задача – это создать в России дискуссионную площадку, где бы молодые специалисты с участием взрослых экспертов могли обсуждать различные аспекты внешней политики России, сделать качественную дискуссию по внешней политике. Мы очень надеемся, что этот проект будет существовать и дальше, что он будет развиваться и что он действительно выйдет на международный уровень. И если вы хотите стать участником проекта «Дебаты Kortunova», мы вас ждем.
So, thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you good luck during these debates.
Встречайте зиму в парке Горького с Теле2 по другим правилам. Для абонентов Теле2 билеты на каток со скидкой 20% в течение всего сезона. Теле2. Другие.
So, good evening, dear guests. It's an absolute pleasure to be welcoming you here today to the 2019 10th anniversary Kortunov Foreign Policy Debates. My name is Laura Chiconia. I have the pleasure of co-moderating this evening together with Victoria and Eric. And because we're on a very tight schedule, I think I'll pass over a word to Victoria and then over to Eric, who can say a couple of words about himself and give us the general information about how today, what the procedure is going to look like. So Victoria, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. I would like to greet everyone who has already joined us and here as well. This year we are going to be more digital, as you know, it's very fashionable now, so I wouldn't take much time. I think that it's already time to begin our debates. I think everybody is waiting already. So just good luck to everybody, and let's give the word to our American colleagues and friends.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Victoria and Laura. It's an absolute pleasure to be collaborating with you. It's a delight for us as the Fletcher School to be working for the first time with creative diplomacy in the Russian International Affairs Council to conduct this 10th anniversary Kortunov debate. So, before we get started, I would like to introduce the polling platform. We are using a platform called menti.com, and if you use the code 370094, you will be able to access the voting and anyone in the audience, whether in person at the Fletcher School, at REAC, or in the U.S., Russia, and elsewhere, will be able to vote both before and after the debates, and we'll have Laura explain the voting procedure. So the rules. We will have 3 debates. Every pair will discuss one question during a period of about 1 hour, and the audience will vote yes and no before and after. That should take no more than 2 minutes. Then we will have 7 minutes for each speaker to give opening remarks. Then we will have a set of 5-minute rebuttals. And then we will have opportunities to ask questions. First, the speakers are provided the option to pose a question to one another, and then we'll use the remaining time to give the discussants an opportunity to comment and raise questions. And of course, if we have time, the audience can also join in. Finally, we will give an opportunity for the debaters to give concluding remarks, 2 minutes each, and then we will have voting again. Laura, I will turn it over to you to explain the voting procedure.
Great, thank you, Eric. So regarding the voting, this year we're trying something new. You are not going to vote for a specific participant or a speaker, but instead vote by answering the question that you will see in the presentation that Eric has kindly showed us and that you can access by using the QR code either on the website, here in the REAC office that's on the table, or you can access it by going onto the website www.menti.com and use the code that Eric said, which is 370094. In the Moscow office, we have little pieces of paper with that information on it, or the QR codes, as I said. So you're going to have to answer the question, the answer to which can be yes or no. You choose your answer. We're going to be voting twice. The first time is before the debates, and the second time will be after the debates. The goal is to see how persuasive our speakers are, and if they were able to change your opinion during the debates. That'll be about it, so I'm pleased to hand over back to Arik, who can get the show started.
Excellent, thank you, Laura. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to check to see if the voting system is working properly, and you can vote to tell us where you're currently located. Where are you currently watching the debates?
So please, I would address to our audience, please, if you can, just try to vote now via your phones.
More men than there are of us. There were a lot of them in that room.
Interesting. Yeah, maybe 3 people voting.
We seem to be good. I think everyone in the hall has access to the system, so as soon as you're ready.
Okay, excellent. Well, if we have others join in later, they will still be able to vote, but they won't be part of the segmentation process for the next questions. So let's proceed with the first debate. So the topic of the first debate is, can economic sanctions really change the behavior of governments? And we are pleased today to have 2 distinguished speakers. On the affirmative side, arguing yes, economic sanctions really can change the behavior of governments, is Professor of International Politics at the Fletcher School, Daniel Dresner. And on the negative, arguing that economic sanctions cannot really change the behavior of governments, is Ivan Timofeyev, Director of Programs at the Russian International Affairs Council. So let us lock in our votes for this question. Jeopardy music. Okay, it looks like we are almost all set. There are a few more votes coming in. Great. So let's proceed with the debate, and I will give Professor Dresner the first word for opening remarks.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be presenting at the 10th anniversary of the Kortunov Debates, and also a pleasure to work with the Creative Diplomacy Unit of REAC. So I'm supposed to argue in the affirmative, which says that economic sanctions really do change the behavior of governments. And while I already clearly have a fair amount of the audience on my side, I have to say that if we are sticking to pure logic, you must concede that my position is correct. The question is whether sanctions change the behavior of governments, and the answer is Of course, sanctions change the behavior of governments, even in instances in which the targeted government does not make concessions that the sanctioning country is asking. We're just asking whether or not governments change their behavior in response to sanctions. I think there's an implicit assumption of, does the target government change its behavior in such a way that the sender or the sanctioning country wishes? But the truth is, regardless of whether or not we think sanctions work in terms of producing concessions, they undeniably change the behavior of governments. Vladimir Putin in Russia does not impose counter-sanctions on European agriculture unless the United States and European Union initially imposes sanctions in response to the incursion in Crimea. Iran does not restart its nuclear program in 2018 unless the Trump administration withdraws from the Iranian nuclear deal and reimposes sanctions in 2018. Sanctions force some kind of response from the target government no matter what. That is a change in behavior. Logically, all of you who voted that said that sanctions don't change behavior, to borrow from Donald Trump, are haters and losers. All right, and you must change your opinion on this. This is increasingly true, I would add, as the sort of maximum pressure campaigns imposed by the United States under the Trump administration have become more punishing in recent years. Whether or not we're talking about Iran or Venezuela or North Korea or what have you, similarly with respect to trade wars. And furthermore, it is not just U.S. financial statecraft. We also see countries like Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, Japan, South Korea are all doing these kinds of things. My research shows that sanctions generate multiple effects on a target's political economy. All right. First of all, there is a deleterious effect on investment. Generally speaking, private sector investment, whether foreign or domestic, starts to dry up. Governments inevitably respond with efforts to blunt their impact through increased spending, which they otherwise would not have to do if sanctions were not imposed. There is also a decline in human development indicators and an increase in corruption in response to sanctions. This is, again, because governments are responding to political unrest created by sanctions with efforts to repress that unrest and stifle dissent compared to their peer economies. Other research shows an increase in the likelihood of currency runs, stock market collapses, and financial crises. Governments will respond with emergency measures to address those things. So again, remember, no matter what you think for the entire rest of the hour, technically you must remember that I win, because there is without question a response from governments in the face of sanctions. Now, if we ask the narrower question of, do sanctions change the behavior of targeted governments in the desired direction of the sanctioning country? Clearly the answer is not always, and I'm willing to concede that point. We've seen Russia, not necessarily respond terribly positively in the face of sanctions after the Ukraine intervention. Similarly with respect to Iran, post-2018. Similarly with respect to the sanctions imposed on Venezuela, Saudi Arabia sanctions imposed on Qatar, the sanctions that Japan has imposed on South Korea, the sanctions that the U.S. and others have imposed on North Korea. That was just off the top of my head that I wrote down very quickly. But there have been clear instances in which targets have changed their behavior in response to pressure from governments in the direction of the sanctioning country. The 2015 Iranian nuclear deal, I think, is the most prominent example, but there are certainly other past examples as well. Think about Russia's imposition of sanctions on Kyrgyzstan's government. Think about the UN sanctions imposed on Cote d'Ivoire. They clearly exist. Furthermore, if you go beyond the targeted government, the hidden effects of sanctions are also rather real. There's a fair amount of evidence that suggests that sanctions are most likely to work at the threat stage, not at the imposition stage. And very often we're not even aware of sanctions that are being threatened. So as a result, the most prominent example of this would be in March when the Trump administration threatened to impose tariffs on Mexico unless Mexico cracked down on migrants coming from Central America to the United States. Again, does Mexico change its behavior? Absolutely. The Mexican government, despite the fact that it is led by a relatively left-wing government that has very little in common with Donald Trump, nonetheless creates a National Guard unit designed, in fact, to restrict immigration across the southern border. Furthermore, there are instances that demonstrate, or research that demonstrates, there's also a deterrent effect to sanctions, which is if one country sanctions another country, third parties observing this will change their behavior because they want to avoid the shadow of sanctions. We've seen this with respect to U.S. non-proliferation policy. Nick Miller has published a research article on this point. And similarly, Tim Peterson has argued that past sanctioning behavior has effect on future behavior of possible targets due to the reputation of the country imposing sanctions, which is, in other words, if countries have a reputation that they will impose sanctions, if a red line is crossed, a potential target will modify its behavior as a result. Now, I don't want to get into the conditions that are on the whole likely to generate sanctions. You know, we all know them. It's the ability to impose costs. It's the ability to generate multilateral support. It's whether the demand is clear and well-defined and whether there's low expectations of future conflict. Now, it is worth asking at this point, what about the abysmal recent record of the United States in terms of actually changing target behavior in the preferred direction of the U.S. government? Indeed, I just published an article in the Washington Quarterly looking at the Trump administration's record. It's not good. It's really, really bad. Is this evidence that sanctions do not affect target state behavior? No. It's evidence that the Trump administration is relying on very bad theories of economic statecraft, and as a result are implementing it incompetently. The U.S. sanctions that are being imposed now are in fact more potent and unilaterally viable now than in the past. Indeed, there is a literature emerging on weaponized interdependence on this very point. The problem is that the Trump administration has responded to this by also escalating the demands it has placed on targeted governments. Things like the return of territory or changes in regime. These are among the biggest asks in world politics. You can have the most powerful sanctions in the world, and you're not necessarily going to get full concessions there. Furthermore, there's evidence that Donald Trump, because he actually had relatively, success with Mexico, thinks that the same formula will work with respect to a country like China. And to put this as plainly as possible, China is not Mexico. These are apples and oranges. So just because it doesn't work works with one does not work with the other. And this is also why the goals for much of the administration's maximum pressure campaigns on the whole don't work terribly well, because the asks being made by the Trump administration are so massive that there is only so much sanctions can do. So in conclusion, 3 points I want to make. First, sanctions always affect the behavior of target governments no matter what. This is true particularly as sanctions have grown more and more potent over time. Second, sometimes they do affect the behavior of the target government in the desired way. And third, and finally, just because the Trump administration has a horrendous record in terms of economic statecraft does not mean that sanctions don't change the behavior of governments. This would be logically like assuming that a bad three-point shooter in basketball proves that it is impossible to make a three-point shot. And with that, I yield my time.
Thank you, Dan. And the next word will go to Dr. Timofeyev.
Well, hello, both to the U.S. and Russian colleagues. Hi, Dan. I tend to agree in a number of points, actually. And true that sanctions affect in one way or another the target states. True that they make harm inevitably due to when we speak about the U.S. sanctions and the UN sanctions, usually they lead to quite a significant economic harm to a target state. True that sometimes sanctions deter the behavior of a target state, or at least make the leadership think twice or 7 times about future escalation and possible consequences. True that sanctions are really changing the behavior of businesses. We have just completed quite a big research of 205 cases of the use of OFAC enforcement actions against international business. And 99% of the companies affected by OFAC changed their behavior. And governments cannot simply ignore this. So they also endure harm, they face harm in banking systems, in banking transactions, etc. True that really sanctions change behavior, and JCPOA is one of the good examples. In 2013, Iranians sat to the table, and in 2015 they joined the plan. So, well, it was a success of the international effort. But still, there are several problems. And here we should be clear on what do we understand by the change of behavior. True and sure that sanctions affect in one way or another in terms of harm in terms of deterrence, in terms of thinking twice, right? But do sanctions really change the behavior of target states in favor of the expectations of the initiator? Well, not always, and I would say that the statistics is quite controversial. It depends on how to interpret it, and this problem is quite well described in the literature. I will figure out several problems which I see and which make me rather skeptical about the efficiency of sanctions than optimistic. The first problem is that big powers may be quite resilient to sanctions because they have bigger resources to soften their influence. So in a sense, they can balance sanctions by different macroeconomic actions to survive and to continue their political course, both at home and abroad, right? So sanctions against Russia is a good example. Russia is still on its track despite the growing sanctions pressure, well, there is no sign that the change will be there. China is even a bigger problem, especially for the United States. We have a start of the escalation of sanctions against Chinese companies and China itself, quite small one, but still. In the US, there is a big debate on what would be the consequences. What would be the retaliation measures of China? Would they harm in return? So again, it's a big problem that a big country may really revenge, not on economic real, but on different other problems. And well, everything is quite different when we get to big powers. Even if you take an example of Iran, well, there were concessions in 2015, but now there are 13 more demands of Mr. Pompeo, and Iran really suffers, right? But Iran does not change its course. It's gradually starting, making steps towards the enlargement of the nuclear program. It maintains its missile technologies, etc. Another huge problem in my view, I'm not American, you know better, guys, but in my view from Russia, decision-making process in the US is a huge problem. So you can actually harm countries, you can use sanctions as a negative motivation, but you have much bigger problems when you use them in a positive motivation, because it's much easier to impose sanctions in comparison with revocation of sanctions, especially when they are fixed in the statute issued by Congress. So this doesn't provide a target state with the motivation to change its behavior. Now Iranians say, guys, what for should we change our behavior and meet the demands of Mr. Pompeo? How would we know that the new president, new administration would not get back to new sanctions if we make concessions? Last but not least, last two quick points. Coalition. Well, coalition matters. United States is a powerful nation in terms of economy and in terms of military might, but even the US often relies on the help of allies in Europe and in Asia to press the target state, and coalitions are not always coherent. Look at what's going on sanctions against Russia. The speed of the EU sanctions and US sanctions is quite different. They were more or less the same by 2016, but now they're quite different. So Europe is much more restrained. And last but not least, methodology. It's really a big problem in terms of methods to identify a real impact of sanctions on decision-making in comparison with other factors. So what really forced a specific country to change the behavior? Was it in case of Iran, for instance, hidden diplomacy or not? Or the issue of the end of Cold War and collapse of the USSR? These were not sanctions which stimulated USSR to end the Cold War, right? I would agree that sanctions may be efficient, they may make harm, they work against allies, as Dan noticed in his book in 1999, they work very effectively against business, but great powers is a problem, coalitions is a problem, decision-making process is a problem, and very often it's quite hard to achieve goals which are desirable for an initiator. Well, nation states differ from business. Nation states may fight to the last cent to promote its political goals. Unlike business, business is different. That's why business is so receptive to the demands of the US regulators. So I'm stopping on this. Thanks.
Thank you, Ivan. Dan, please go ahead. Okay. Well, thank you, Ivan, for gracefully conceding defeat on this. That was very generous of you. And I'm glad that he does concede some of the points I made, namely, A, that sanctions, again, do in fact change behavior, regardless of whether it's behavior in the direction of the initiator. That sanctions do indeed have a deterrent effect, potentially, on third parties. Sanctions are more likely to work with allies and adversaries, and he's absolutely right that sanctions definitely change business behavior, particularly with respect to the United States and OFAC's use of what is now increasingly called a whale hunting strategy, which is if they go after one big firm and impose a significant fine, that definitely has a deterrent effect on other firms as well. And in the spirit of bilateral cooperation, let me also concede a few of Ivan's points that I completely agree with. First, the notion that sanctions are less likely to work against great powers. I completely concede this point. I don't think that's necessarily a shock. It is unsurprising that the U.S. trade wars imposed on China have generated, I believe, a tentative Phase 1 agreement that, in fact, is a set of, at best, meager concessions on the point of China. And indeed, according to many calculations, even if you believe all of these surface announcements, will actually lead to an outcome that is less economically beneficial for the United States than if the United States had not imposed the trade war in the first place. Similarly, with respect to Russia, I think Russia has demonstrated that it has significant resources to be able to resist the imposition of sanctions by the United States and the European Union. Don't dispute that. I also agree, by the way, with Ivan's point that the United States increasingly over time has found it very easy to impose economic sanctions and extremely difficult to lift them. And indeed, this is a function largely of Congress, which is Congress, it is very easy for Congress to impose sanctions, mostly because it's a gesture that it wants to express a symbolic act with respect to foreign policy. However, there's always points for members of Congress for sounding hawkish towards a particular country. There's almost no political benefit for members of Congress to act dovish. And so therefore, even in the few times we've seen efforts by an administration to lift sanctions, let's think Iran or the Cuba opening, they've been done primarily through executive action and been relatively easily reversed, as we've seen as the Trump administration has done after it succeeded the Obama administration. In areas where I'd want to push back, I would really just raise 2 points. The first is Ivan's suggestion that the coalition matters, that cooperation is absolutely essential to successful economic sanctions. There, I'm not as sure this is the case now as it used to be. And again, this goes to the problem of what Henry Farrell and Abe Newman describe as weaponized interdependence, which is because the U.S. is at the center, and let me be clear, I'm primarily talking about the United States here, is at the center of sort of key economic networks, namely with respect to capital markets and with respect to cyber. In fact, as it turns out, the U.S. can impose sanctions unilaterally, and even allies have to comply. And I think the best example of this has, in fact, been the imposition of sanctions on Iran in 2018 and 2019, in which the U.S. forced SWIFT to accede to U.S. demands, despite the fact that SWIFT is a non-profit based in Brussels, and the European Union was a vociferous opponent of this unilateral reimposition of sanctions. And so there's no question that the fact that the U.S. was able to get its way on this does demonstrate that, in fact, maybe multilateral cooperation is not as important as it used to be. Relatively, we can have a problem with that, but positively, I think, as a sort of objective analysis, I don't think that's in dispute. And finally, I would close with respect to the great PowerPoint. If we go back to David Baldwin's book on economic statecraft in 1985, he raised an important point there, which is when we judge the effectiveness of economic statecraft, we always have to say compared to what. And I would generally suggest that it's not obvious to me that military statecraft against great powers would have any more likely a chance of success than economic statecraft. and in fact would be much more costly in a variety of ways. So, to say that sanctions don't work against great powers, I would be happy to concede that point, or they're less likely to work in terms of changing the government's behavior in the direction of the initiator. I will concede that point. What I will not concede, again, is that sanctions, whether it's a great power or a small power, does change the behavior of the targeted government, and overall does tend to have more effect on smaller states. And I'll end there.
Thank you, Dan. And for the last rebuttal, Ivan. Ivan, we can't hear you.
Unfortunately, we don't hear Ivan, so we try to understand what happened.
Ivan, I think we lost you.
Yeah. Just 1 minute, sorry.
I think Dan weaponized the microphones.
I just think it's unilateral surrender on Ivan's part. Okay, but perhaps in the meantime, while we're waiting on Ivan to reconnect, let's have a beginning of some commentary from the audience. We are running a little late on time, and perhaps we can start on the REACT side. Laura?
Yes, right. So let's jump right in. If anyone in the audience wants to express their opinion regarding what you heard, maybe ask a question, share some insights, then please feel free while we are currently working on slide. Oh, we seem to be back.
We got one back.
Hello.
Okay, we'll then get back to that later.
Yeah. Can we proceed? Can we continue?
Please do.
Go ahead.
Yeah, good. Thanks. Well, first, pig whales, Brian Early has recently made a big work on it, but indeed, if you look at the statistics of this year, this were only, a minority of them. The majority were not the big whales, rather small companies or, small cases. So again, I agree that it works against business, but this is not just the big whales. I would like to stress on another point. Sanctions may be dysfunctional in a way that they decrease or may potentially decrease the trust of international players, first of all governments, into the US-led dollar system, right? So there is, in my view, there is a growing feeling in China, in Russia, and beyond that the US may overuse this leverage to promote their economic interests, but not dealing just political problems. Right, so in a long prospect, this may stimulate big powers like China and Russia. Well, first of all, China and Russia is not capable enough to, to contribute to the fundamental change of international financial system. But in the long run, sanctions may be dysfunctional, undermining trust, and contributing to the gradual destruction of the existing system. And if the United States is not a leader in the international financial system, then sanctions may be completely different in terms of harm they make and in terms of their efficiency. So, sanctions may be may achieve in one way or another the goals, first of all, in terms of harm, but they have another quite a dysfunctional nature, mostly for the U.S., for the prospects of the U.S. Financial financial system. And again, I would like to get back to the Russian and Chinese case. We have an interesting situation here in the country. On the one hand, we have a trend which supports Dan's point. For instance, our big banks are doing a great job to comply with the U.S. legislation. So Sberbank, Gazprombank, so they are living on the horizons of DASCA and the term, but at the same time, they are very 100% compliant to the demands of the OFAC. And same with Chinese banks. Chinese banks are very compliant too. But at the level of governments, there is a different thing. There is a growing concern. There is a growing preparation to the worst scenarios to preserve, let's say, what is called sovereignty, to protect the banking system. So again, great powers have bigger resources to do this. And at the same time, they can be black knights for smaller countries. So we had this in the Cold War when Soviet Union effectively balanced the U.S. sanctions against Cuba. So Cuba now has big problems now because it doesn't have black knights as it used to have. But black knights is something which may get back, undermine the efficiency and making the meeting of the demands of a target state of the United States and others much less effective. So I'm stopping on this. Thanks.
Thank you, Ivan. Now, Dan, would you be interested in asking a question? Let me ask one question, I guess, of Ivan, which goes to this point, as you say, of concerns about U.S. abuse of the financial system and, potentially causing problems to the role of the dollar. I don't dispute Ivan's characterization of neither China nor Russia are necessarily big fans of this, and I know that Russia's taken efforts to try to wean itself from the dollar, and China too has tried to create an alternative payment system to start reducing use of the dollar, and even Europe has created this Instex, a potential workaround mechanism for Iran. And yet all of this combined has not really at all dented the reliance by both private sector and public sector actors on the dollar. So isn't this in fact evidence, I without getting into whether or not the U.S. has abused the financial system, and I think in that question, Ivan and I are in closer ground. Isn't it indisputable, however, that despite U.S. abuse, there hasn't actually been a fundamental change or a lack of reliance on the dollar, which in fact suggests the U.S. can keep doing this?
Well, yeah, it's a very good question. I would rather agree with you in rational terms, right? When it comes to calculations, that true dollar is very effective. It's cheaper to use dollar as a universal currency, and it's a huge global asset, global good, I would say. But at the same time, on the level of perceptions, of decision makers, and even on the level of institutional perceptions, there are growing concerns about this. So this is what I see both in Beijing, in Moscow, and in Brussels and European countries and capitals. So I will say that we now have a clear plan or strategy of what to do with this. So rather, at this point, these are sporadic attempts to do something like Instex, which doesn't work completely, also due to the threat to get to the SDN list, right? Because it's private company, so no problem with putting it to the SDN. But I don't see a coherent strategy on the Russian and Chinese side. But what I see is a growing concern and growing demand to strategies on this, and this in the long term may be a problem for the use of sanctions from the U.S. side. And a quick question from my side. It relates to Russia. Do you think that if it theoretically imagine the situation that Russia changes its political course, for instance, together with Ukraine and Europeans under the auspices of normative format, we are moving forward to Minsk agreements implementation. Do you really believe that Congress will lift sanctions? Well, I'm not much skeptical about the executive orders, but do you think it's doable on the level of Congress? This is a fundamental problem for decision making, because there is an assumption that this would never ever be done. And Jackson Vanik is one of the examples, Iran is one of the examples, etc. I would be interesting to hear what you think about this.
I think I would largely concede I think the answer is I would be skeptical that you're going to see significant congressional change in a short period of time. To be fair, I don't think this is entirely, this is often because, and in some ways it gets to the dysfunction point that you raised, which I, by the way, don't necessarily disagree with in many instances, in which sanctions might be imposed for reason A, but there is underlying reasons B, C, and D that are also at work. So in the case of the U.S. sanctions against Russia, we have to be blunt here. While Ukraine is definitely one of the triggers for it, the 2016 election and the Russian interference in that election is also something that is affecting, I think, the way members of Congress are behaving. I would point out, I guess, the one thing I would say is that Jackson Vanik eventually did get lifted, even though it took it did take a very long time, and it also took a concerted effort by the intellectual, by the expert community. But I do think that if there was evidence that Russia was pursuing a more constructive course in world politics, and that evidence, accrued over time, I do think eventually even the U.S. Congress would see reason, which is quite a statement. But I do think it would eventually happen. But when it comes from Congress, it's extremely difficult to change. Although the other thing I would add is that most of the congressional sanctions have some kind of national interest waiver put into them, which does give the executive branch some flexibility in terms of their implementation.
Great. Thank you, Dan and Yvonne. And let's go straight into comments, and we'll start with this side. Please introduce yourself and try to keep your comment to no more than a few minutes.
Hi, I'm Carol Savitz. I teach at MIT, and I'm here as a guest of the Fletcher School. I'm not sure you guys really disagree at all. I'm very serious about that. I think that there's a nuanced disagreement between you. I like the distinction between changing behavior and which specific behavior might be changed as a result of the sanctions. I mean, the reading that I've been doing about what's happening in Russia is that the economic sanctions may not have forced Russia to withdraw from Crimea, hasn't forced them to withdraw forces from Donbass. At the same time, there's growing dissatisfaction among the population with the stringencies that they've had to deal with. And there was a Levada poll recently in which 51% argued that Russia should get out of Syria, like why were we there? And there's growing dissatisfaction there. So that could ultimately lead to a change in behavior, whereas it's not immediately obvious. And just one other point, I'm promising to be quick. It's this whole question of coalitions. I think it depends on what country is the target and what behaviors you're trying to change, because the EU, for example, just rolled over all the sanctions against Russia, even as, Trump is beating up on the Europeans and everything else. So there's a real consistent coalition going on, whereas with Iran, since we unilaterally pulled out, the Europeans are much more reluctant and are looking for ways to go around the sanctions that we've now imposed.
Thank you, Carol. Laura, I will turn it over to you.
I'd like to encourage our audience to comment, add anything that they might find relevant, and also please, can you start off by introducing yourself? Yes. Does anyone have comments, questions? Yeah.
Hey guys, this is Cyrus Newland over on the REACT side. I'm affiliated with CSIS, and I'm here in Moscow for a year with Bank of America on an Alpha Fellowship. And from Bank of America, I just want to comment that I've sort of been able to see how financial institutions react to both sanctions and the threat of sanctions from the inside. I just wanted to highlight and then maybe seek some feedback from you guys on this point, that the idea that it's really the threat of sanctions versus the sanctions themselves that are the biggest kind of have the biggest market moving impact, because markets essentially want to anticipate things before they happen, and by the time sanctions are actually applied, often the effects of those have been priced in to some extent. So it's really the threat of sanctions that freaks people out, and I can tell you from the inside, it really does freak people out. And then just a question to Dan, I guess, because he's on the U.S. side. about the reemergence of the DASCA bill in the Senate. This was kind of dormant for a while, but the Senate Foreign Relations Committee just yesterday passed it. For sanctions watchers, a lot of us had kind of thought that Congress had coalesced around a view of sanctions that was a bit smarter, you might say, that emphasized the deterrent effect of only applying sanctions after a finding of foreign interference had happened as opposed to doing it right away. And then DASCA comes back. I'm just curious if you have any insights on, you know, where Congress's mind is on the whole sanctions issue, and whether, speaking to my first point, there is some kind of instrumental value for Congress in perhaps just keeping the Russians guessing, even if they don't have full intention of carrying through with DASCA or passing it all the way. Just the very act of reintroducing it is enough to sort of jitter markets in a way that serves U.S. foreign policy interests to some extent. Thanks.
Okay, do you want to respond to all of the questions or just that last one?
You can respond to the last one.
The last one. Thanks. In terms of the question about Congress and sanctions, and the reintroduction of JASTA and towards Russia, I would say the following. The fundamental fact of life with respect to Congress and sanctions is, unfortunately, Congress loves sanctions. It is their preferred foreign policy tool, and I think you can only understand it in the context of the fact that they have largely conceded other foreign policy tools to the executive branch. Even though technically in the Constitution it's up to Congress to declare war, they ceded that power to the President a long time ago. Congress is ostensibly supposed to set tariffs. Again, in terms of trade policy, they by and large have conceded that to the President a long time ago, beginning in 1934, even though they do play something of a larger role. Sanctions for them are the perfect tool to try to play, have a voice in terms of foreign policy, because they are seen as, on the one hand, a powerful signal, and yet on the other hand, not necessarily so significant in some instances that it ties the President's hands. So along those lines, I would argue that by and large you would expect to see Congress pass these laws or threaten to pass these laws right up until the moment that they realize there might actually be real-world complications for U.S. businesses that in particular contribute to their campaigns. And so in that sense, and by the way, when I mean real-world consequences, Congress doesn't necessarily care all that much about whether or not the targeted population is affected. They do care, to some extent, but they care even more about whether the U.S. economy is affected or whether the effect on the target economy is so large that there would be knock-on effects, more systemically. And so I think in the end, any time Congress threatens to pass something that would legitimately have a, significant systemic effect on a major component of the global economy, they're going to pull back.
Thank you, Dan. So we're running low on time, so let's have one more comment or question from both sides, please. Yes.
Hi, Vitaly Kosev from Endicott College. I have one question, just summarizing the debate and just considering the participants' Q&A and their perceptions and their points. One thing is that when we ask the question, can economic sanctions really change the behavior of governments, can we just talk differently about the great powers behavior and the secondary powers behavior? So just given the fact that we have that great powers or the powers with certain potential are able to respond and tolerate sanctions, and the secondary powers might be really finding themselves in a tough position, and their governments are more ready to respond and to make some concessions. And second point is it possible to impose comprehensive sanctions against a great power? So when we speak about that, like Ivan was saying, that Russia is not, and Russia or like Iran or China might not be changing their behavior. But would it be possible that the United States or the West is willing to apply comprehensive sanctions kind of killing Tufts sanctions against these nations, given the point that Dan was just voicing, that it's like might be harmful for the United States economy and businesses. But is it possible at all that the United States might impose comprehensive sanctions, including the internet, the SWIFT, the infrastructure and technology, access to technology, which actually might freezing assets of Russia in the United States, which might really be devastating. So can we just possibly, even hypothetically, speak about this in this weaponized interdependence framework? So if we speak about weaponized interdependence, where is the borderline between the non-harmful imposition of sanctions and harmful imposition of sanctions? Thank you.
So we'll allow both Dan and Ivan to respond, I think, in the concluding remarks, but let's give someone on the REACT side a chance to give a comment or question. Laura?
Yeah, I'll press this one.
Thanks. I don't know if you can see me. I'm here in the background. It's Pavel Konevsky, Associate Professor at Lomonosov University. And I have a particular question to Ivan, because I know that Ivan did a lot of job on analyzing sanctions, how they work in different countries and experience from different regions. And my question is actually, to what extent can sanctions actually improve the economy? But I know it's quite a simple question, but I'm especially interested in a case that, for example, and you may take Russia as an example, if we have sanctions and then at some point these sanctions have been lifted, can you actually say, I know it's pretty hard to answer this question because it's a very hypothetical possibility, but if sanctions are lifted after some time being in place, can you actually say that they helped the economy to be more dynamic? Are there such examples in global experience that sanctions have been in place for some time and then they've been lifted and after that economy started to grow faster, or they did some conclusions, or they improved some sectors? So I'm not talking about a case when sanctions are replaced for decades, right? I'm talking about, let's say, midterm perspective.
So, Ivan, would you like to respond briefly?
Yeah, who is responding?
Yes, Ivan.
Okay, good. Thank you. Well, first, very good question on Levada poll. Well, true that in Russia there are growing numbers showing the discontent of the public with the economic growth and quality of life, etc. But I would like to get back to the methodological issue I mentioned in my speech, that it's really hard to identify the role of sanctions in this equation. I'm really not sure that sanctions is a trigger which makes the public dissatisfied with what's going on. And I would list first much more heavy factors if I make a model of this, like structure of economy, slow economic growth, rule of law and the shortcomings of the rule of law, institutions, etc. So the fact that we have growing discontent does not necessarily mean that sanctions is a cause. Maybe there is an indirect effect, but, well, we don't know. As for great powers' behavior and comprehensive sanctions limits against great powers, I would refer to the case of Turkey and recent sanctions of the US against Ankara for Syria. We saw that, yes, theoretically and formally, Turkey changes its behavior, and formally this was a success. But on another side, the US political establishment, NATO, also had to keep in mind that Turkey is one of principal allies in the Middle East. So the price of raising sanctions escalation would be much more than the benefits, technical benefits from their use. So I felt that there was a restraint on the US side to use comprehensive measures against Turkey too. And this raises again the question of the efficiency. Yes, there was an impact, but, well, what kind of impact? I don't think it was great, and it was quite constrained. Last but not least, Pavel's question on the benefits to the economy. Some Russian sectors are beneficial from sanctions. First of all, agriculture and military production. And I even know one guy who is a producer of cheese, and he celebrates, it's a holiday for him, he celebrates the day when Americans impose sanctions, right? Because he gets state subsidies and he has a market now. But I wouldn't be so optimistic about this, because yes, there are bigger state subsidies, but the economy becomes more dependent on the state. It becomes less effective. It is limited in terms of crediting, so it doesn't have finance. It has limited finance as a fuel to boost the economic growth. So I would be so optimistic about the impact of sanctions, about the positive impact of sanctions, though in some sectors, yes. And this is not just a Russian problem, this is the problem of Iran too. Sanctions make state sector more corrupted and business more corrupted, and therefore less efficient.
Thank you, Ivan. Dan, your concluding remarks. Again, I want to thank Ivan. This has been a constructive debate, and I tend to agree with Carol's observation that we actually agree a fair amount more than we disagree. Most importantly, that sanctions clearly do change the behavior of governments, which, remember, was the question in the debate. But that said, I would close with a few points where I might disagree or disagree a little bit with Ivan. First, one point I will concede, which is sanctions are always costly. Much like the use of force, which is often the substitute, sanctions are outlawing what would otherwise be ordinary market activity. If you assume that markets function relatively well, then you are automatically creating inefficiencies when you impose economic sanctions. So, of course they're costly. They're costly to both the initiator and to the target. You should never not acknowledge that. In terms of the financial sanctions and whether or not the effect, in sort of Ivan's question about methodology, I think it's absolutely fair to point out that it's often difficult to draw a straight line between sanctions and, let's say, political unrest. That said, you can argue one of the innovations with respect to financial sanctions is the ways in which they have actually reduced what we used to call the rally around the flag effect, like comprehensive sanctions. When you impose comprehensive sanctions, very often the target population would actually wind up supporting the target government because they wind up adopting a more nationalist position. Financial sanctions that tend to target state entities and particularly members of a ruling coalition, because they tend to hurt elites far more than they tend to hurt populations, don't have that same effect. And so as a result, this has actually been one of the ways in which sanctions, I think, have been more effective more recently than they've been in the past in terms of generating, somewhat greater unrest. And then the last point I would raise is that we think, again, the assumption is always, well, sanctions are presumably imposed sometimes because you want some kind of demand that the target government will concede. We have to acknowledge that there are times where sanctions are imposed where that's not the purpose. The purpose of sanctions is containment. The purpose of sanctions is to reduce the capabilities of the targeted economy. I would argue to some extent this seems to be the case that's motivating the Trump administration's imposition of sanctions on China in terms of the trade war. You can argue in some ways it reflects things like COCOM that existed during the Cold War, where the goal wasn't to bring the targeted government to its knees. The goal was to restrain or constrain the capabilities of the target government, and I think in that respect absolutely did impose changes in behavior. And the last point I would raise is that I totally understand Ivan's point about raising black knights. It's certainly a possibility, but again, that is a change in the behavior of governments. The fact that countries are now considering themselves being black knights in a way that they wouldn't have before, change in behavior of governments.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan. Ivan, do you have anything left to say very briefly?
Well, actually, I think that this is an exhaustive discussion, and I'm fine with it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much to both of the debaters. So in one moment, we will all have a chance to vote again on the question. And so, as we discussed earlier, the more of the audience, not necessarily that got the most votes in total. So
Sorry, Eric.
just to remind you,
Could we ask you to repeat that? The connection was lost for a second, just so that our audience could hear what you said, the last sentence.
yes, so this is the vote as it was at the beginning of the debate before anyone had a chance to make any arguments. So now we will vote on the question again. Can economic sanctions really change the behavior of governments? Please vote now.
No one's been persuaded.
Still bipartisan. Not very partisan. Not
Okay, I believe that concludes the voting. It looks like maybe there are a few more members of the audience who want to vote. Well, it looks like it's basically a tie. So we had in the first vote 28 yeses and 10 noes, and now we have 23 yeses and 8 noes. So Dan and Ivan, congratulations to you both. Thank you, Ivan. Great. Well, I will turn it over to Laura for the next debate.
Great, thank you, Eric. So we're going to now move on to the second round of debates. The topic that we're going to be discussing today is, are the United States, Russia, and China doomed for confrontation? Before we jump in, I want to introduce our speakers. The first one representing Russia is Pavel Kanievsky, Associate Professor in the Faculty of Sociology at Lomonosov Moscow State University. And from the side of the United States, Sulman Khan, Associate Professor of International History and Chinese Foreign Relations at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Let's start off with the vote. If you could get onto your devices once again and answer the question, are the United States, Russia, and China doomed for confrontation? Please answer the question if the app is working. Eric, can you hear us? Then we will wait. But you can vote, yeah, if the app is working.
It's not working.
Okay. We'll just deal with some slight technical difficulties, which hopefully won't take too long.
Да-да-да, я понял.
So we're waiting on the REACT team.
Gotcha. I can see them.
Eric, can you hear us?
There they are.
Great. Lara, can you see us and hear us?
Yeah, we can see you. Can you see us and hear us?
Yes, we can. So please go ahead.
I think we should wait.
Is Suman there as well?
Yep. Sulman is here. Sulman, we can't see you.
Let me see what I can do about that.
Maybe then, in order not to lose time, because we're quite behind schedule, we can start off with Pavel's speech. Great.
Suman, can you hear us?
I can see
Excellent.
Great.
Very good.
Great. So, getting back to where we left off, we were in the process of voting. Those of you who weren't able to vote, please get online and do that just now. I think, has everyone in the Moscow office voted already? Seems to be so. Great. All right. How are you over there? Has everyone voted? Eric, hello, can you hear us?
Yes. So it looks like everyone has voted and it's approximately split. Laura, I will allow you to start the debate.
Great, so let's jump right in. I'm going to hand over to Pavel Kanievsky.
Thank you, and greetings to everybody, and especially to our colleagues on the other side of the ocean. And thank you for Creative Diplomacy and REACT for inviting me to speak on this very interesting and very thought-provoking and very broad session, I would say, because the question is, are Russia, United States, and China doomed for being in confrontation? And I think when we talk about such words as doom, fate, or karma, we're entering some kind of Middle Ages religious debates, you know, because it reminds me of the ontological debates that took place in the Middle Ages concerning the existence of God. But anyway, I think that doom is really a very harsh word to describe current situation and dynamic of relations between such big powers as Russia, United States, and China. And I think what we actually have to talk about is not if these relations are doomed, but if we are in a dead end now, And for how long can we be in this dead end, especially when it comes to Russia-US relations, but not only, and how dangerous is this dead end for global security? So I myself find myself in quite a new world, because my personal position is much closer to something that you could call liberal institutionalism. But on the other hand, what we see today and what we see happening in international system, the way it evolves, especially for the last decade, is not that drives nations closer to each other, and especially when we talk about big nations. So I would say that there are some underlying factors, some very deep underlying factors that actually led to current stage of unwinding confrontation. And Andrei Kortunov, starting our today discussion, said that we probably reached the low level of these relations. I'm not really sure about it, because I think that dynamic can go in many different ways. And talking about these underlying factors, and you already guessed that my position in this debate will be yes, with some exemptions, of course. So one of the underlying factors is that we are witnessing what I call a revival of nostalgic nationalism. And I think that reasons for that are many, and you can speak about it for many hours. These are globalization, conservative discourses that are evolving at home, and growing self-interest is achieved individually rather than through cooperation. And hopefully we can see these trends reversing at some stage, but history teaches us that the rise of nationalism cannot be countered easily, because it's not just simple change of attitudes inside the ruling elite. It's a much more complex structure of economic and social factors. So it's not just a simple inter-elite relations. I'm pretty much into structural issues here. But then again, there are explanations from the point of rational choice. Because I think when we talk about Russia-US relations, we see a situation when it's simply not in American interest to involve Russia into its orbit of influence, like it was happening in the 1990s, when the United States viewed Russia as a democratizing power, as a partner that needs to counterbalance security issues, to deal with remaining nuclear arsenal and many other issues. But then again, Russia was actually, if you look back 20, 30 years ago, Russia was of a secondary importance for the United States, for US foreign policy, unlike former socialistic socialistic republics in Central and Eastern Europe. And Russia, in fact, was willing to become a full member of the Euro-Atlantic family. I mean, you can argue with that, of course, but I see that there is a growing understanding in the United States that probably Russia was not dealt with properly, and probably the United States should have chosen different strategy towards Russia. And you know that there are a lot of talks today in the US and in the West in general, who lost Russia. But I think that there is a growing understanding that Russia is a country that always needs some kind of special status, whether you like it or not, but it's just part of its national identity. So this is quite a constructivist argument, I would say. And I think by making this mistake, by having this kind of American-led balancing in Europe, and especially in Eastern and Central Europe, you have now a huge stumbling block for Russia-U.S. relations in the form of these Central and Eastern European states, and the U.S. preferred to check its policies in Europe and in NATO-Russia relations as well through these countries. And the biggest problem, as I see it, is that it's not of a realistic but rather constructivist nature, because these countries build their identities on historical memories, actually just like Russia does. And I think that historical memories to pretty and historical narratives to a pretty large extent drive policies of these countries, and this is the way the US views situation in Europe in general. Another thing is that, and then this is when we come back to great power balance, is that Russia slowly convinced itself is that United States is not just unipolar power that doesn't really care about international institutions, but when they need to follow their national interests, they just can't do that. So why can't Russia follow the same line? And then you have China, which actually doesn't make things easier, because China's foreign policy is different from Russia in the sense that it's much more rational, and because China is much more dependent on the West and on China. But the major idea would be that strategically Russia and China closer to each other than ever before, and Russia doesn't lose anything by moving closer to China. There is a view that Russia risks to become China's junior partner. But my point is that Russia doesn't really care as long as it is a strategic partnership with China that helps to improve its status globally. And I wouldn't, by making this intermediate conclusion, I wouldn't go too far by saying that relations are doomed to be permanently confrontational, but the structure of international system is evolving in a way that it's not favoring rapprochement between major powers. Thank you. I will pause here.
Great. Thank you, Pavel. Sulman, you now have 7 minutes to take the floor.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. This is a pleasure, even at enormous jet lag on the other side of another ocean. I'm in Taiwan right now. I was very happy at the beginning of our session to hear the Lord of the Rings, which I also approve of, invoked, and the line I would have invoked, given the debate and given where we are, is also a war scene, but it's Strider, or Aragon as he's known, consoling a little kid who's saying, "The men say there is no hope." And Aragon looks him in the eye and gets very serious and says, "There is always hope." That's one of the lines that stays with me from that movie. There are a lot. And on Russia-China-US relations, while I'd agree with Pavel's assessment of where we stand right now, in essence, though we might disagree on the particulars, and I'll get to that in a bit, I'd maintain that there is always hope. Why am I maintaining that? I'm going to give you 3 reasons. The first has to do with the distinction between agency and structure, or between systems and choices, and how that can play out in the near and long-term future. The second reason has to do with the logic of a triangular relationship. So we're talking about a US-China-Russia triangle. And the way that triangle works might be a little different from the way people conventionally assume it does, and that could incline us to cooperation rather than confrontation. And then the final point I want to make is that the need for cooperation between these 3 countries is such that, logically, they should incline to it. But that, of course, will depend on choices, which brings me back to the very first point I mentioned, agency versus structure, or systems versus choices. Now, I'm the child of a doctor who works in a Pakistani government hospital, and when things go wrong, my mother's residents and everybody in the hospital complains, "Ma'am, it's just the system." And my mom's response to that is always, "You are the system." The system's not this autonomous functioning thing that does what it wants to. It's made up of individuals who make decisions. And I think as much as it applies to the running of a hospital, it does apply to international relations, not in our stars, but in ourselves, as Shakespeare said. If you look at U.S.-Russia relations, U.S.-China relations, and China-Russia relations, yes, structure matters, but the choices people make within those structures matter too, and that's what really gets you to confrontation or cooperation. If you want to look at where the current fault lines are, it took choices on all sides. It's a choice on the American side to expand NATO and launch a trade war that doesn't make sense. It's a choice on the Russian side to annex Crimea, interfere in an election. It's a choice on the Chinese side to dump tons of sand into the South China Sea, thereby upsetting everybody in the region. These are all decisions people made. They're decisions previous leaders had not made. If you look at where relations were in the past, whether you're talking about the Hainan spy plane incident between the U.S. and China or the 1995-96 Taiwan Straits crisis, if you are thinking of the Cuban Missile Crisis, if you are thinking of arms reduction talks, we can see how wiser choices were possible, and wise leaders, or leaders in moments of wisdom, made those choices and backed us down from the edge of confrontation. So to say right now that because of the system we are somehow doomed to confrontation, or even a more mild phrasing of, well, confrontation will happen, seems to me to be unnecessarily privileging a system and robbing leadership and elites and people within countries of the responsibility to make choices that lead to a better future. The past has shown that sound decision-making does work. There are sound decisions that can be made today, which I'll get to at the end, that could help with our current predicament. So all in all, I think putting too much stake by the system is a bad idea. Even if you look at the system and think of it as a triangular relationship, the logic of a triangular relationship is not based on confrontation. This is a misunderstanding people, including academics, typically have. But if you look at how a triangular relationship is supposed to work, the idea is that you're supposed to be closer to all the sides than they are to one another. That's how it worked in Bismarck's age. That is, if you look at the logic Henry Kissinger used or Deng Xiaoping used later, the kind of relationship people sought in times of stress. And that relationship means not that, as we say now in the United States, we were reaching out to the Chinese to box out the Soviets. The idea was that by opening up a decent relationship with the Chinese, it would give one the leverage and standing to have a decent relationship with the Soviets, and vice versa. In other words, you seek closer ties with one another in order to maximize the possibility of ties remaining good with all sides. It's a tricky concept, but one that seems to have worked by and large. Russia and China don't necessarily, as historians seem to me, to be much closer than before. They seem to me to be cooperating where they see fit, with the understanding that they won't if that relationship doesn't work out. And for the United States to box itself out of that triangle seems to me to be short-sighted. Logically, it's not something you would pursue as a practitioner of balance of power politics. Now, actually, undoing that pursuit depends on getting, as I said, people making the right decisions in office, but that's a longer story. The idea of a triangular relationship that fosters competitive cooperation rather than confrontation is one that works best when the stakes of the overall relationships are clear to everybody. In other words, you have to have a reason to cooperate, an inducement to, and Pavel was mentioning that it's not an American interest to involve Russia right now. I think that's unfair in that there's the perception that it is not an American interest, but if you actually think about the interests of all three sides right now, it has never been more in their interest to work together. Think of arms control talks, so crucial to all of us surviving. Think of global climate change, whether it's causing fires in Siberia or California or making China's water supply unreliable. These are problems that are common to all of us. They are rated by security experts across the board as both the most dangerous and the most pressing problems that we face right now. It is impossible, to my mind, to conceive of solutions or a solution to either of these problems without China, Russia, and the United States all on the same page saying we have to work together for this. It can't be done.
without that. If you look at the U.S.-China relationship in the 90s, there was a perception of mutual interest. China needed the United States to get trade access, needed it to get into the WTO. The United States needed China as a market in the region and as a responsible stakeholder, to use a phrase. The perception of those larger interests, ditto with Russia, the perception that denuclearization mattered, for example, meant that despite everything, they were able to work together at points. It's never been more pressing than now. So if we make the right choices, I would say there is still hope.
Great, thank you, Sulman. I would now like to ask both of our speakers to clarify their positions. Let's start with Pyro. You have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. So yes, actually, I would love to support Sulman your position, and it's not that I'm super pessimistic. I also want to be hopeful that we can actually move from current dead end to some kind of new stage of relations, and I believe that younger generation, for example, is really capable of doing that, solving mistakes of previous generations, miscalculations, misthoughts, etc. But I think that, and I also would want to add that actually we can't really predict how relations will evolve because they are always dynamic. And even though we say that relations are bad now, especially when it comes to Russia-US relations, I mean, nobody could predict how situation will evolve in the late 80s. Nobody could predict the end of the Cold War. And we are now in a much smoother situation compared to Cold War because I agree that we don't have the same kind of ideological confrontation, although, and this is the topic of the next debate, I think we still have a lot of contradictions in terms of values. And this is really that is really different from previous era of rapprochement in the 90s. My big question would be is can we really cooperate without working institutional structure? Because bilateral ties is a good thing, but I think that history of Russia-US relations teaches us is that when you rely only to bilateral ties, you are much more vulnerable to home policies. Because if you have changes in one of the countries, and now we witness a situation when we have changes in both countries, and this is what I linked to my previous idea of rising nationalism, it can really lead to confrontation. So this situation of bilateral rapprochement is much more vulnerable, and this is pretty much a problem for Russia, just like for China, that is really not an important member in any well, let's say Western-led international organization, although it tries to change its position, but at the same time you have this discourse coming from the United States that China is a constantly growing threat. And on one hand, you have these hopes of a better future, but then you have current discourses that you have to deal with. And that really deteriorates Chinese elites and makes them diversify their global ties beyond Asia-Pacific. Russia and the EU, for example, are obviously two blocks China sees it as a part of its future economic and security architecture. And I think we really miss the European Union part in this triangle here, so it actually should be a square. But then again, it's a very unequal square because you have the United States, which is economic and military power. You have China, which is economic and growing military power. You have Russia, which is military power, and you have the European Union, which is economic power. So this kind of balance, I think, it's not very stable, and I don't think that trying to build this strange lines between these four blocks will lead to creation of some kind of long-term alliances. I think it is really a kind of new balance of power, but unlike previous balances of power that we had in history, this balance of power is actually not based on any hardline agreements. This system itself is very dynamic. So this is a situation when we have very unstable balance of power, and I believe that balances of power are always unstable because there are no clear dividing spheres of influence, no red lines, etc. So we keep seeing new red lines evolving all the time, and there is no guarantee that we will have that we will not have a new red lines drawn in the next decade, for example, because we simply don't have instruments to not make states draw new lines. So this is what has been happening with Russia. This is what has been happening with the United States even before it happened with Russia, and this is where I connect to my idea of Russia's vision of the United States as a unilateral power that can actually do anything it wants. So I think even if we create some kind of rules, it will be hard to fit them for all these four major powers. Therefore, anarchy is becoming a new normal.
Great, thank you, Pavel. Sulman, I'd like to invite you to take the floor for another 5 minutes.
Okay, great. And that was terrific stuff. I suspect actually that Pavel and I too are closer to one another than the debate format might make it appear in some ways. Because I would share his assessment that it is a new balance of power. I would share his pessimism about the current situation. My position, to clarify, is not that where we are now is not a bad place. It is. It's just that the past suggests we have got out of worse places, and there are, to my mind, ways forward from here that we can all pursue. The first thing I would say would be that in terms of the balance of power, one of the things that will have to change on the American side is actually learning how balances of power work. There's this illusion that, Pavel was mentioning that China has diversified its relationships. It's been doing that forever. American intellectuals still think in terms of U.S.-China relations, not China's foreign relations with Russia, Japan, South Korea, North Korea, Africa, where have you, all as part of a matrix in which the United States fits. The idea that Russia is a great power, which to my mind is absolutely correct. It is a great power, has been a great power for as long as most of us can remember. It's had its ups and downs, but in terms of great power status, it's always been there to my mind, is one that the American foreign policy establishment has yet to internalize properly. And Europe, but you're absolutely right, should be a part of this conversation, was fortunately not in the debate, or this could have gone on all night long, is also set to be a part of that, and is thinking of itself increasingly under Macron as a great power. So that discourse is there. And I think it's fair to say that all sides will have to adapt to that. In other words, the United States will have to stop seeing itself as protector of a unipolar world, which may or may not have ever existed, and learn to work with other people. Some acceptance of that is going to have to come from other places as well, whether it be China or Russia. Saying that it's dynamic and it's not easy is absolutely true. I don't think you're going to see stable lines of communication emerge. I don't think you'll see set alliances based on shared values emerging. That, to my mind, is profoundly unrealistic. But a balance of power is something that requires constant management, constant attention. In other words, it's not something you can say done and set, but you'll have to have people paying attention at all times. So I would actually like everybody in the decision-making process, from the people at the very top in Moscow or Washington and the captain on the boat in the South China Sea, have a little placard in front of them when they're working saying, what are the stakes of the larger relationship? What happens if I fire the first shot? How can I de-escalate the situation right now? Actually have a manual for de-escalation right there and then, and see how that would work out. So in terms of where we go from here, there's a couple of very simple solutions that we can pursue just to not build trust, but at least reinstitutionalize the idea that people can work together. starting a new arms control treaty that isn't just a US-Russia treaty, but a US-Russia-China treaty. What does that look like? It doesn't have to be pursued at the top levels of government at this point. That's a non-starter right now. But simply as a track to dialogue, or as something people get together and talk about from time to time. Or what actions can all of these people take right now to curb emissions contributing to climate change? These are very simple conversations that can be had. And simply the process of having those conversations might disabuse us of the idea that we're doomed to confrontation.
Great, thank you, Salman. Now I would like to invite Pavel to ask a question to Salman. You have 1 minute to ask the question, and Salman will have 3 minutes to answer. So you can take the floor.
I usually have a lot of questions, but I will stick to only one of them. Salman, I think that what you were talking about now about the second track and communication is highly important, and I mean what Helsinki process taught us is that communication is the most important thing that can actually drive nations closer to each other and make them understand better each other. But then I think that actually what was the real game changer were the changes that were happening in the late 80s and early 90s, is that when both Soviet Union and then early independent Russia had a shared vision with the United States and the West in general. So we are celebrating 30 years of political change in Europe this year. And there are a lot of discussions what went wrong, etc., but we are where we are. So my question would be, do you see any hope of this kind of paradigm change happening and some kind of new vision evolving? So where exactly could it come from? Will it come from the people? Will it come from the elites? Or I mean, what is your... I'm sorry, it's a very broad question, but we're having a very broad discussion here.
No, that's a very terrific question. I think my response would be twofold. One would be to say that shared vision wasn't quite as grand as it sounds in retrospect. There were elements of it that were shared, denuclearization. There were elements of it that were not. So the Americans had the illusion that the Russians were buying into their vision for Europe, and I think that was a deeply contested idea in Russia. It was, yes, Russia wants to be a part of Europe, but doesn't want to be part of Europe in American terms, and that was something that the Americans had no idea was going on, at least insofar as reflected in the policy. And I think, you know, if you think about where those visions came from, they're rooted much earlier than the 80s. They're rooted in détente, the first people from the Soviet Union traveling to the United States, the idea of some more openness and stuff coming in over time, going further back to Helsinki, and even farther to Gorbachev's childhood. So I would say those changes take time and they come about in ways that we don't necessarily expect. I would say shared vision spaces are small, but they're significant. So everybody could come together around the goal of, we can't have nukes running around Ukraine and Kazakhstan, for example, and have to do something about that. I think today you could build a shared vision around the need for arms control. You can certainly build a shared vision. You've seen a shared vision on the question of dealing with climate change. The idea is injecting it with enough urgency to get stuff done. So that would be my position. I wouldn't hope for a grand bargain, but I would hope for sufficient cooperation in areas of sufficient importance to help us all get along and solve those problems.
Great, thank you, Salman. Perhaps you have a question that you'd like to ask Pavel?
I do. Well, I have, like Pavel, a lot of questions, but I'm going to focus on one because he mentioned the younger generation. And I wanted to ask what hopes you see on that front. What kind of generational change is taking place in all these countries, but particularly in Russia, that would leave you to be either pessimistic or optimistic about the state of the future?
Well, I can actually tell you an example because I myself belong to a network that is called Younger Generation Leaders Network, and I know that Chris Miller on the other side is also a member of this network. And I think it exists for 5 years already. It was created in the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis in 2014. And I think what my personal experience is that younger generation is really much less vulnerable in sense of let's say ideological, confrontational rhetoric. The way I see it is that a younger generation is really able to overcome stereotypes from the Cold War. And they are able to build completely new discourses, much more innovative and much more cooperative at the same time. And I think if we had more cooperation on the younger generation level, I mean it can be a problem for official decision making, but and I mean even on the official level, especially in Russia, you can see these changes happening. By the way, and you can see younger generations coming to decision making in the government, in the diplomacy, and they really make a difference actually. So it is really one of my major hopes that this generation is actually much more united globally. I mean it's different because you have many different kinds of younger generations. You have younger generations who are voting for conservative and populist parties in Europe, but especially when you take expert level, you can really see a difference. And I think this is where a change can come from, and this is where I'm actually optimistic.
Great, so I'd now like to propose moving on to comments from the audience. Perhaps any questions? Let's start off with the Moscow office. Does anybody have any comments, ideas, insights that they'd like to share? Okay, let's move on then to the questions from Boston. Arik, perhaps someone on your side has a question or a comment.
Great, thank you so much, Laura. So, in the interest of time, let's have a couple of questions or comments that we collect, and then we can move on to the concluding remarks. So, please, anyone.
Right. I like this idea about a shared vision somehow mitigating the potential for confrontation among the 3 parties or 4 parties, depending on which structure you suggest. But what specifically can you see as some kind of a shared vision? I'm not sure the 3 major powers even agree on the sources of climate change. I'm not sure that we agree on an awful lot at this point, and I would like to know what that architecture is that would prevent the disputes from getting out of control, basically.
Yeah, one more question. Just a kind of comment. How would we in today's world when the great powers, China, Russia, United States, it's not the 19th century great power management. It's all about the remaking process. So all the 3 powers are competing and actually entering into the rivalry for making rules and changing norms. And I cannot envisage the United States in particular, and there was some mentioning of the U.S. position, the U.S. position, and U.S. striving to maintain and preserve the unilateral world order, or the rules which liberal rules which are like rule-making capacity. If the United States is not willing to break up with its principles and deviate from its values and norms. And so what we see today is since Russia and China are not able to impose on the United States the new rules, Russia and China have to engage the United States into some sort of multilateral cooperation in different forms to create certain regimes so that the United States would be accommodating or kind of accepting the existence and the role of Russia and China in this new rule-making or agenda-setting environment. So in this respect, even despite all those global issues facing the world, which require the cooperation of the three countries, especially in particular, I would not see that in terms of a new order forming effort. I do not see a real prospect of cooperation at this point.
Thank you both, and I will now turn it over to Laura and to the debaters for concluding remarks.
Yes, if we could start off with Pavel, you have 2 minutes for concluding remarks.
Thank you. So it is indeed a very big topic, and it will be hard to make one conclusion, but I will try to be accurate. And I think that one of the comments was about shared vision. It is really a way of building some kind of more peaceful environment, but then again you have shared visions coming not from the supranational level. These visions usually evolve from the national levels, and I think this is what happened in the 80s, is that we had so many common visions coming from different national levels that actually coincided in this democratic wave that united all these countries, including Russia. So this was a very unique moment, and I think that shared vision you can't really find on a rational basis, and this is where I slightly disagree with Sulman actually. I think that we are in the very sophisticated and very hard sphere of values. And this is actually a problem. But I think what we should think about today is how not to let this confrontation that has different scenarios, and it has negative scenarios as well, how not make it evolve in this negative direction. You must have a very accurate crisis management at the moment, just not to let situation go out of control. You have to really understand what could be negative impacts when it comes to Russia-US relations or US-China relations, because there are so many vulnerable points that can actually stimulate conflicts and more confrontation. So I would say that we are in a confrontation now, and our major task now is not to let this confrontation go further. And for this you need dialogue, for this you need communication, for this you need common understanding of major threats. So unfortunately we can't really talk about values now, but we must talk about these rational things, and this is where I actually agree with Sulman. Thank you.
Sulman, your final remarks, please.
Sure, and I'll take from those two questions. I think the first thing I would say is that in many ways the balance of power politics we're seeing are very much like the 19th century. There's the illusion that it's now a world of rules and order and liberalism and all those good things, and it's really not. There's no more or less emphasis on values and norms now than there was in the 19th century or even the 18th. The values and norms have shifted slightly, of course, as they do. So have the instruments of power. But I think resigning ourselves to the fact that great powers still exist and they will have to deal with one another is just one of the ways things is going to have to be done. And that's where the shared vision bit comes in. I think Pavel's right to point to the evolution of it. I think it's also true that it evolves from the ground up, so not just from nations, but from cultural contacts too. If you look at the denuclearization movement, there's a lot of different sources for that. I would completely agree that there's very little prospect for that working out now, right now, at this moment. That in itself to me is a reason to start now, to start the conversation about, well, what are the sources of climate change that we all do agree on and what can we do about them? What are the rules of the road for arms control that we can all agree on right now, and what can we do about them, with the hope that not now, but 5, 6, 7 years down the line, that shared vision, if nurtured in this moment, can bubble up and inform a new architecture.
Great, thank you, Salman. I would now like to invite our audience and our guests to go online and to reassess the question that was initially asked of, are the United States, Russia, and China doomed for confrontation? So if you could please answer yes or no, and in a minute we will move on to the third round. So I presume everyone was able to answer? Eric? Oh, it's still changing.
So we're still waiting on a few more votes, it looks like.
While we're waiting then, Eric, I'd like to hand over to you for the third round.
Great. So I think that just about concludes the voting. So earlier, before the debates, we had 18 yes and 18 no. And now on the question of are the United States, Russia, China doomed for confrontation, we have 10 yes and 15 no. So I think in this case, the victory in the debate will go to Salman. Payo, thank you so much for your participation. Salman, congratulations. Great. Well, let us move on to the next debate. And this final debate poses the question, do Russia and the United States currently face an ideological clash? In this debate, we will have arguing in the affirmative Chris Miller, Assistant Professor of International History at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. And on the negative side, arguing no, Russia and the United States currently do not face an ideological clash, is Alexei Naumov, journalist at Communism Business Daily newspaper and an expert at the Russian International Affairs Council. So please vote now.
Lost it on the screen.
There we go. It's back. Shall we launch in? Okay, let us go ahead and start the debate. Chris, the first word is yours for 7 minutes.
Great. Well, let me start by thanking REAC and Creative Diplomacy for co-organizing this event, and ARC and our end for helping to get all this set up. We're very excited to collaborate for the first time with our colleagues in Moscow on this event. So when you pose the question, do the U.S. and Russia face an ideological clash? It seems to me the hardest thing to do, but the most important thing to do is to define what we mean by ideological. It's sort of a grandiose word. When we think of ideologies, we think of great topics in philosophy or in politics, and when you look at politicians across the world today, certainly in the United States and in Russia, great ideas about politics isn't the first thing that comes to mind. And I wouldn't put either President Trump or President Putin in the category of profound political thinkers, whatever their political records. So in terms of ideologies, I think we have to look not at the theories that are expounded, nor even the sets of ideas that are discussed, rather how people act. And so I would sort of bet dumb down the question to a certain extent and define it slightly differently, which is to say, do different ideas about how politics ought to work shape the U.S.-Russia confrontation? And there, I think the answer is yes, that you can look at how the Russian government operates, how the American government operates, and they have different expectations about politics, and that this explains part, not all certainly, but part of their foreign policy disagreements. Now, the second big issue when looking at the role of ideas in foreign policy is that both the United States and Russia are big countries with many peoples that have very different ideas, and certainly anyone who looks at the American political debate, today being an interesting example, we just impeached our president yesterday. This is a period of ideological debate of different political views, and so too in Russia in different ways, but I think no less substantively. There are very different schools of thought that were present. When I was last in Moscow last month, with my colleague Arik, we heard many different perspectives about what Russian foreign policy ought to be, about what Russian domestic politics ought to look like, and so I'm of no illusion whatsoever that it's possible to talk about a uniform ideology either in the United States or in Russia or really in any other country for that matter. So again, when talking about ideological differences between the United States and Russia, you have to kind of consider the median viewpoint about what politics should look like rather than asserting that everyone has the same view, because certainly across societies and even within governments, of course, you have different views as to what ought to be, what is good, and what is bad. Nevertheless, I think it is possible to identify some ways that ideas about politics have shaped U.S.-Russian disagreements over the past decade or two. And I think the first way to look at that is to examine what the world would look like if there weren't ideas about politics that shaped disagreements, if it was all about what my political scientist friends might call interests. And the question of interests, do countries who operate in the national interests, of course, begs a further question, which is where do these interests come from? Are they delivered by God onto the peoples of the world, or are they themselves shaped by ideas? And I think the answer is obviously the latter, that different people have different ideas, and therefore they conceptualize their interests differently. And you can imagine a situation, if you're familiar with the board game Risk, which I used to play when I was a middle schooler, with different armies conquering different territories in the world. If all of the countries of the world had similar ideas about politics, then when you got into disagreements in the national stage, you could just draw lines down the board and divide territories in that way. And if it were easy to draw a line between countries, then I think resolving disagreements between the U.S. and Russia would be rather more straightforward. We could just draw lines across the map and be satisfied with that. But of course, the world's not that simple, in part because we're not just trying to grab territory, we're trying to shape the world in a way we think it ought to be shaped. And so this is why I think the question of different political ideas comes to the fore. It's not just possible to agree 50-50 or some other ratio of interest. We need to consider the ideas as well. So what are the different ideas that shape policy in the United States and in Russia? Well, here I think you need to look at who are the actors that affect how foreign policy is made. And I would submit that in the United States there is much more pressure placed by the population on the government over foreign policy questions. For example, we just had a discussion in part on U.S.-China relations, and today there is great pressure on the Trump administration to consider issues of human rights in relations with China. Whereas in Russia, I would argue that there's less pressure that the population places on the government, and that foreign policy is more centralized in the hands of a smaller group of people. And that as a result, popular pressures have different roles in their influence in the population. And this, I think, shapes what ideas the foreign policy processes create. So in the United States, it's a very popular view that it's important to have, in addition to order in society, also freedom in society. And when the government tacks too much in the direction of order, the populace demands that the government take freedom into consideration. And so you have many instances in U.S. foreign policy where the government wants to act in sort of realpolitik direction, and in fact gets criticized by Congress, by the media, by other actors for ignoring freedom. In Russia, I think this happens much less frequently, not never, but less frequently, because there are fewer actors that are making demands on the government, and those demands that are made are focused in different directions than in the United States. So that would be the first category, looking at who's affecting policy and what they're demanding. And it does seem like in the United States you have much more focus on issues of freedom and human rights, whereas in Russia you have much more demands focused on issues of order and stability. The second point I'd like to make, and this is looking at the results of this difference in the policymaking process, is in the types of governments that the U.S. and Russia seek to promote around the world. And here, too, I think you see something of a divide, and we can argue about which country is in the right, but I think the divide is pretty straightforward. The U.S., in many parts of the world, even where it doesn't make sense in objective terms, supports governments that are more democratic. Now, it doesn't always support democracies. At times it has a confused policy where the one branch of government supports democratization, other branches support dictators, but there's always this tension of at least some desire to support democratic regimes. Where in Russia, it seems the opposite tendency is in place. Actually, when you look at which governments the Russian government has supported over the past decade or so, where there's been a question, I think the Russian government has had a preference for strongman regimes on the thesis that it's easier to relate to one individual or a smaller regime than it is to relate to more divisive or divided polities. And so here I think you see a good example of ways in which ideological preferences about what society ought to look like shape foreign policies as they play out in practice. A second area where you see this divergence between the U.S. and Russia on values grounds is in international institutions. What types of policies do the two countries push in international institutions? And here, too, you have this divide where Russia tends to focus more on questions of order, sovereignty, and the United States tends to focus more on questions of individual liberty. So internet regulation is a great example of this. At the United Nations right now, the U.S. is pushing an agenda of personal data protection, of freedom of expression on the internet, and Russia is pushing a focus on state sovereignty and the ability of states to set their own regimes separately from concerns about liberty. So these are just two examples, I think, of where you see ideology or ideas about politics shaping foreign policy. But in the interest of time, I'll wrap there and turn it over to Alexei Naumov.
Thank you, Chris. Alexei, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Well, I think you properly discuss an ideological conflict or an absence of ideological conflict between U.S. and Russia. We have to define what ideology really is. So a political ideology is a set of ideas, beliefs, values, and opinions exhibiting a recurring pattern trying to influence public policy and making an attempt to justify, explain, contest, or change the social and political arrangements. So we can say that political ideology has to be clear and stable, rigid, meaning non-flexible or flexible to an extent with a very rigid core which is never flexible. Impactful, meaning that it has to have a profound effect on reality, or at least trying to make a profound effect on reality. And it has to be more or less accepted by everybody in the public, or at least in the majority of the community. So if we take a look at the polls and see if Russia has any ideology, I don't think it has any, because a stereotypical Russian thinks that Russia is a great power which is defined by well-equipped army, strong national spirit, whatever that is, and a good and powerful president. And the main national priorities, according to a stereotypical Russian, have to be keeping the nation stable while expanding its overseas influence. Is that even an ideology? Well, Soviet Union was an ideological country. It was ready to sacrifice material gains for the sake of its ideology. For example, funneling vast amounts of money into African satellite states, actually disregarding its own citizens. Russia, however, is not an ideological country. Modern day Russia has been struggling to define itself to the world and to its own people since its very own conception in 1991. We are, as Russia, we are a successor to the Soviet Union, a successor to the Russian Empire, and a modern European state. So how do you combine this into an ideology? How can you say that this nation has a set of ideas that is rigid and is basically, that it is able to exert or export towards other countries? Modern day Russians, many of them, they have seen the ideology of socialism crumble before their very own eyes, and they're very, very skeptical. Russia's political elite always, well, not always, but often thinks that any ideology and any talk of ideology is only a smokescreen for political and economical interest. And Russians are very adaptable. It is very hard to gauge an ideology in a country which has strong authoritarian tendencies. I think I was growing up in the 90s, and I remember how welcoming the country was to LGBT movement and homosexuals. It's very different now, but the people are still the same. It's the media, it's the culture, contemporary culture, so you get the idea. Well, Russia's modern-day quasi-ideology can be boiled down to being a global disruptor. Russia demands respect, Russia demands sovereignty, and Russia is ready to act when its interests are threatened. But Russia's policy is mostly reactive, not proactive. So, for example, we see that the United States is facilitating regime change in Ukraine. I'm not saying this is what happened, I'm saying this is the way it was perceived here in Moscow. So Russia reacts by taking Crimea. We see that the United States is supporting opposition in Syria. We react by supporting Bashar al-Assad. And Russia is very flexible. I think you can say that we support the fight against Islamic extremism on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have talks with Hamas, which is, questionable given our opposition to Islamic extremism. Well, U.S. on the other hand is more of an ideological of the two, shall we say. Its population did not have to see its ideology crumble before their very own eyes, and they have that national myth going on for more than 200 years, so that's pretty okay. We can definitely see ideology at work. So, for example, when the U.S. invaded, conquered Iraq, and toppled the regime of Saddam Hussein, they did not take the oil while having the ability to take the oil. So that's a good plus for the ideology. But the problem, however, is polarization. I mostly cover U.S. internal politics, and I've seen a poll yesterday which said that 80% of Democrats believe that the Republican Party is taken over by racists. And 80% of Republicans believe that the Democratic Party is taken over by socialists. So we see polarization basically dictates a very different interpretation of values. For example, America's leading role in the world. For current President Donald J. Trump, its leadership position could be interpreted in the way that we are the strongest country, other countries must pay us money for our protection. His predecessor, Barack Obama, had a radically different opinion. We are the strongest country. We can support other countries and provide protection. So, as I see it, for the United States, ideology, in its interpretation of ideology, is one of the basically reasons that it may think about when doing this or that in the foreign policy, but it is never the guiding principle. It is never the main idea behind foreign policy. So while Russia has no ideology at all which it can export, the U.S. has an ideology, but its value is greatly diminished because there is no communism, no arch enemy, and that is why I do not see how can we describe what we're seeing between Russia and the United States as an ideological conflict. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexei. Chris. Great. Well, thank you, Alexei, for those comments. I think I broadly agree with your characterization of the way ideology affects U.S. foreign policy and also the way it's changed over time. I think the question is with regard to Russia, and here I think ideology in sort of the Soviet sense of the word of having a Marxism-Leninism and official interpretations. I agree there's very little echo of that in Russia today, but on the question of do ideas shape politics, there I think I do see more scope for ideas, and I guess you can play a thought experiment. We could play a thought experiment in our heads about how different powerful countries choose to define their interests abroad, and I think here there's many examples of countries with big economies and the potential to create large militaries, and some of them make certain decisions and others different decisions. And I guess an interesting case study in my mind is why is it that a country like Japan, the world's third largest economy, has decided to have a foreign policy that's not very active, have a military that's only a fraction of the size that it could create, has decided not to create nuclear weapons, has decided to basically follow the United States in most key questions internationally. That's because the Japanese people decided, there's a very strong peace movement there, they've decided to define their national interests in one way. And if Japan wanted to, we know historically that they can become extraordinarily powerful in Asia, taking over, as they did in the 1930s and 40s, Taiwan, South Korea, or all of Korea, big parts of China. And since then, they decided not to do that. And so it's difficult for me to explain that simply by looking at interests. I think the ideas of the Japanese play a role there. And I think in Russia, I would say ideas play a role too in the definition of what Russian power ought to achieve. For example, Russia defines its role in the world stage very differently than, say, Germany or France or Britain do. Russia thinks it's a great power, more powerful than these countries, and it defines its power not as working with other European countries, but trying to assert an independent role in Europe and Asia. And that's a fine decision for Russians to make, I think, but it does seem like it's a decision based on ideas. The demand that Russia act like a great power and the willingness to spend resources on the military, on trade conflicts with neighbors, that's a decision ultimately based, I think, on politics rather than on the national interest as narrowly conceived. And I guess that's the sense in which I would argue that Russia today does have a foreign policy based on ideas that assert the importance of being a great power, a definition of great power along military lines, and a willingness to expend a lot of energy and resources to defend that great power status in a way that many other countries that could be great powers along those lines have made different decisions. And so we can debate whether that's the right decision or wrong decision, but it does seem to me a decision that has been made by the Russian people in aggregate and by the policymaking class in specific. And it's a decision, I think, that's been based on the ideas that are shared among the Russian elite, which are different ideas than you'd find if you went, for example, to Berlin and spoke with foreign policymakers there.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. Alexei.
Well, I agree with your statement on Japan. However, we have to take into account that Japan was defeated in the war, and previously, before it was defeated in the war, it was a very nationalist, jingoistic regime. So I don't think it's very applicable to expect from anyone, from Russia, to expect a behavior similar to Japan or Germany, which were defeated in the war. As for the role on the world stage, I agree that Russia thinks of itself as a great power and asserts its independent role. However, I don't think I don't think Russia does that because it wants to. It thinks that it does that because it has to. Because Russia does not think, Russia's ruling class does not think that Europe is an independent actor. They see it since the Soviet times. Russians see Europe as an avant-garde of U.S. foreign policy, as U.S. military might. Well, because of NATO, you can actually say that this is a pretty good explanation. And as for the end game and for the end goal of this Russian militarization, Russian assertive power in the world stage, I just wanted to ask, what do you think is Russia's end goal? Because to my mind, the end goal, the end game is to be protected, not to be influenced by any other party, to preserve its own sovereignty. So Russia's always thinks it acts on the defensive. It is never seen as active in, installing regimes, supporting militias. Russia's also always supporting, you've mentioned that Russia has a preference for supporting strongmen. Russia always has preference for supporting powers that Russia deems legitimate, that were, for example, elected or basically took power 30, 20 years ago, but are now ruling the country. So that's that. And I basically think that this is not an ideology. This is not something that Russia puts forward and that actively tries to do. Russia wants to preserve its independence and freedom and acts only in defense, the way it sees it. So it is not an ideology that can be exported. It is not an ideology that explains everything Russia does, because Russia is basically playing very smart with its own strengths and while realizing its own weaknesses. Russia can derail any and every international attempt to resolve any conflict we can name, we can imagine. But it only does that so its interests are taken into account, its safety is guaranteed, and its interests are not harmed. So I don't see it as an ideology, as a coherent set of principles and ideals, but rather a reaction to the hostile world, because Russia, frankly, is used to being surrounded by not so friendly powers. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexei. So I would now like to invite the debaters to ask questions of one another. Chris, would you like to ask a question?
Maybe, I think Alexei posed a question in the previous comments. I'll answer that one if that works. So I take your point that Russia thinks that it's acting defensively, and I understand that viewpoint. It strikes me that in most conflicts in history, all sides think they're acting defensively. So, for example, in an example that seems kind of absurd from today's perspective, when the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, the Bush administration genuinely believed that the Iraqi government had weapons. They thought it was a defensive war, which in hindsight looks kind of incredible. But in fact, when you rewind and look at most wars in history, all sides feel like they're the one threatened by outside powers. And so that to me then begs the question, well, why do countries feel threatened by certain trends at certain times and not at others? And there too, I think the question of ideas about politics does come to the fore. So I'll give you an example. In the expansion of the European Union, Russia has long seen a threat. Now you could ask, well, why would Russia see the expansion of the European Union as a threat? Turkey doesn't evidently see the expansion of the European Union as a threat. Morocco doesn't see the expansion as a threat. Russia does. And if you set Russia's national interests as they've defined them, ideas that are somewhat unique to Russia that are not shared in Turkey or Morocco or in any of the other countries that border the European Union. And so that's where I think I would again turn to the role of ideas in explaining Russian foreign policy. Not that Russia is following a sort of a playbook that was sketched out by Marx and Lenin as might have been the case during the Soviet days, although even then we could argue, but rather that there are certain ideas about threats and opportunities that are different between Russia and other countries. Russia is not, I don't think, particularly unique in having its own set of perceptions about threats and opportunities, but it does seem like the sense of threat and opportunity is different in Russia than it is in many of its Western and European neighbors, and that's where I think many of these disagreements come from. I guess I would pose in response, Alexei, a question about how we describe motivations of countries on issues besides security questions if we don't turn to ideas. And it seems like the previous discussion with Sulman and Pavel raised a number of common interests by their definition, but not common interests by other people's definition. Sulman brought up the question of climate change, which is where we see in different countries vastly different responses. In part, I would suggest because there are vastly different perceptions within countries about whether it's real and if so, if it's problematic. And it seems like both Russia and the United States are countries where there's serious debate about whether it's real, whether it matters. And that would seem to me to be a place where ideas about politics really do matter in how countries respond to the issues on the international stage. How would you respond to that question?
Well, I would say that basically discussions about things different than security policy basically support my position of absence of any ideology. Russia supports combating climate change because it suits Russia's national interests. We, for example, would build nuclear power plants all over the world if countries pay us enough money. So I think in every case, security, climate change, anything else, national interests basically are more important than ideology, which is very rigid and non-flexible. So, for example, countries that rely on coal, China, for example, they will say that climate change is probably not very real, but we're not going to do something about it because we need our coal and our coal-powered power plants. So, I think in every case, national interests are more important than ideology because you cannot really expect people to follow ideology in every case because ideologies usually very limited when it comes to foreign influence. It mostly has to do with security. So, as I've said, national interests over ideology. Thank you.
Okay, so perhaps we can open it up for comments or questions, and I'll invite anyone on this side.
I'll take a jump in here. I'm not sure either of you defined ideology, and I think there's a lot more agreement between you than appears. I guess I'm the conciliator this morning. I said the same thing to Dan. Ideology to me means a formal set of ideas that would dictate certain policy. Perhaps I would put on my constructivist hat and talk about ideas and identity being the frame through which, or the prism through which, a state views its external interests and everything else. And if you take it that way, I think you're actually agreeing with each other. I think the other thing that I'll throw in, Chris and I were just at a conference where we talked a lot about some of these issues. I think the other thing that I would throw out is that I think Russia is looking to regain the status that it lost when the Soviet Union collapsed, and that is, it's not an ideology, but it's a feeling, maybe it's an idea, but it's not an ideology, of looking for ways to reassert its status, and the United States is acting from the position of, well, we already got the status, and therefore we can act with more impunity as we pursue our other interests. So I guess my question to both of you really is how you define ideology and how what you've discussed sort of fits into that rubric, if indeed we're accepting it at all.
Alexei, Chris, who would like to respond?
I could start.
Do you want to start?
Thank you. So I think you can very easily distinguish an ideology from a set of ideas. When you're ready to sacrifice your economic or political gain for your ideas, this is an ideology. As I've mentioned, Soviet Union was ready to sacrifice the well-being of its own citizens for promoting socialism abroad and building a network of satellite states. When you're not ready, when you'd rather do something than not do something, this is only a set of ideas. So I think that is the main difference, and that is it. Thank you.
But I would argue that today Russia is willing to, or the Russian government is willing to sacrifice the well-being of its citizens for the creation of satellite states. If you look at the costs of wars in Ukraine and Georgia, military expenditure, sanctions, and so, and I wouldn't say that Putin is an ideologist in any sense, nor the Russian foreign policy elite in general, but it does seem to me it's harder to draw the distinctions between an ideological foreign policy and a foreign policy that preferences certain things over others. Ultimately, foreign policies are about making choices about what you preference, and I don't think you can have a theory about how people preference different things without a sort of value-based sense of what's more important. You know, we talked about politics versus economics as goals, and even that preferencing is ultimately a value judgment. Would you rather have an economic good or a political good? Well, it's hard to know how they would relate with each other unless you give me a sense of what your values are vis-a-vis politics and economics first. So there too, I think I would agree with your claim, Carol, that neither of us have defined ideologically closely, but I guess in the history of international relations, it seems to me hard to find an example of a country that has been truly ideological in the sense of being irrational by any definition and simply pursuing some sort of ideas bereft of a calculation of the power politics around them.
Thank you both. Laura, I will turn it over to you.
Yes, we actually have one question over here, so I'll just pass the mic over to Pavel.
I would come so that they can actually see me because I'm hiding there in the shadows. It's Pavel here. I just couldn't resist myself making a comment, I think, rather than asking a question, but whether you would want to react, please do. I would like to start from the point that Chris made on Marxism-Leninism several times, and I think that we really have to draw some connections between the past and the present, because they do exist. And I think that when you go back to the 70s or 80s in the Soviet Union, you wouldn't find many people who really believed in communism, who really believed in the global communist revolution. I mean, communists stopped being an internationalist ideology driving Soviet behavior abroad a long time ago. But what was the driving force behind
Soviet communism, especially late Soviet communism, was actually something that you could call anti-Western conservatism with many nationalistic parts of it as well. Actually, why communism existed and why it was in place for such a long time is that people actually had many advantages from it. On a personal level, you could see people contributing from the system on a purely social economic level, and on the level of decision making, on the level of political elites, on the level of nomenclatura, communism was actually a guarantee of Soviet status globally. So this is something that helped Soviet Union to preserve its power at home and abroad. And when situation started to change in the 80s, when people started to want more from the system and it actually couldn't give it to them, this is when people really started to think that this is an outdated ideology, etc. And the social political transformations that were happening in the socialistic bloc in the 80s as well, they also very much diminished communist ideology. So in this incarnation of the past, of the Soviet time, it actually died at some point. But this anti-Western conservative part of it actually never went away. And in the early 90s, you had this end of history moment when people had huge expectations from the new time and new regime, and what they faced in the 90s was actually not a great new world. It was actually kind of Great Depression. So this end of history ended as well pretty quickly in Russia. So what you had later, you had this kind of reintroduction of this neoconservative, anti-Western rhetoric that actually just got back. And ironically, what we have in the United States now is that American political scene and society is also partially hit by this end of history moment, because you have this huge anti-neoliberal wave that is ridden by Trump. So I would say that ideology in this sense never went away. It just came back in different form, and it's much more complicated because it's not just capitalistic communist ideology when you have this clear understanding of what is what. It's much more complicated, but it was created, it was recreated by old ideas and old thoughts that's just resurfaced in a different era.
Well, I'll just quickly comment that I partly agree with my colleague here, but the thing is that I think that this was a quasi-ideology. The notion of ideology being able to fade away and come back so quickly means that it is not an ideology at all. It is a response. It is a reaction to current events. So, for example, we've said that Russia is acting this way or that way because it follows a certain set of ideas and principles. And for example, it acts expansively. It tries to influence other countries. I say Russia acts this way because it feels threatened. And if the threat goes away, Russia's actions will also diminish. For example, the great disappointment with the West happened in the 1990s because Russia was faced with severe economic crisis. It turned its face to the West. However, the West shunned Russia and did not provide, for example, vast humanitarian relief, Marshall Plan 2.0, or something like that. And Russians fell back to what they knew from the past, to this quasi-ideology, which was never really an ideology, as my colleague there mentioned, since the start of the World War, when the international had to cease. So I think it's a quasi-ideology, and the ability of it to quickly fade away and come back means that it is not a proper, coherent ideology at all. Thank you.
Back to a topic raised both by Pavel and by Kirill, this question of status, which seems to me maybe not properly an ideology, but something that can't simply be explained by interest alone, because certain countries demand different status at different times, and I think you can watch political coalitions within countries shift and the demands for status shift too. So I think you've certainly seen that between different U.S. administrations over the past several decades, different perceptions of whether the U.S. should act alone or in collaboration with allies. And in Russia too, it does seem like shifting domestic political coalitions from the Brezhnev era to the Gorbachev era to the Yeltsin era to the Putin era have also brought different perceptions of what Russia's status is and what resources Russia should be willing to devote to have that status recognized. And so perhaps this isn't an ideology in sort of a strict definition, but it does seem like it's more than a national interest, because the national interests, if their interests, ought to have stayed constant over time, whereas the willingness to fight for them and the willingness to devote resources for them has shifted quite drastically based on perceptions of whether status is being recognized or not. And ultimately, it does seem like this question of status is driven by, in many cases, one's own domestic political ideology more than foreign ideologies. That is, when you look at the big debates both in the United States and in Russia, as politics has shifted back and forth, questions about whether we should prioritize foreign questions are often actually derivative of whether we should prioritize domestic debates first. That's, for example, what led to the Gorbachev shift in the Soviet Union. That's what led Barack Obama to slash the defense budget in the United States when he came to power in 2008. And so I think there it's a political question, it's a question of ideas that leads into status rather than a question of interests coldly conceived.
Thank you both. So I think we have time for just one more comment or question from both sides. So if anybody has one, please.
Yes, Italian Kortunov here back. My belief is in terms of ideological clash, I would agree with Alexei that Russia is pursuing a more pragmatic policy, and some people in Russia are saying that it would be better if we had some ideology. On the other hand, the United States is excessively ideology-driven, in my view, and especially the so-called establishment and elite in Washington, D.C., and those who have to use ideological and some value-based norms and perceptions to defend America's actions, American policies in the world. So it's in terms of ideological clash. Is there ideological clash on the Russia side? That's why Russians do not see ideological clash. They just look at this clash as driven by politics, by both domestic politics in the United States and also some so-called imperialistic expansionist strategies of the U.S. administrations. So I would say that it's a yes and no. It's very hard to determine, but both debaters having their own very grounded opinion, which actually would deserve to be considered. Thank you.
Thank you. So I now invite the debaters to make their concluding remarks. Chris, please go ahead.
Well, I hope we haven't done something so horrible as to agree with each other. So I'll try to be provocative in my last 30 seconds. Let's see, where should I start? I think when you zoom out and look at the shifts in U.S. and Russian foreign policy over the past several decades, it's impossible to explain them simply by interests alone, which is why you've had the U.S. and Russia going from being Cold War rivals in the time of Reagan and Brezhnev to being very much closer under the time of Bush and Gorbachev, to being best friends in the days of Bill and Boris, back to being rivals again. In many ways, the interests haven't changed. The issues on the agenda at summit discussions haven't changed. What's changed are the domestic political coalitions and the perception of what the values ought to be, what status ought to be achieved. That's what's driven ups and downs in the U.S.-Russian relationship. And so I think I would preference those issues as explanatory variables rather than the interests, disputes about arms control or security interests, which seems to me have been relatively persistent over time, but their relevance has changed drastically as people with different ideas have decided to either prioritize them or deprioritize them, as the case may be.
Thank you, Chris. Alexei?
Thank you. So, to conclude, I'd like to underline that ideologies are to be expectable. So for example, if that little country is having a little socialist revolution out there, so the Soviet Union is going to support it because it is socialist and it is promoting socialist ideology. You can expect the same outcome from the same set of variables you introduce. This is not the case with Russia. This is not the case with the United States. Russia, for example, opposes the Muslim Brotherhood while having talks with Hamas. The United States opposes Iran while having a very amicable relations with the Saudi prince, who does not have a very good human rights records, if you know what I'm saying. So I'm saying that every single time national interests are more important than ideology, because you have to be ready to sacrifice your national interest to ideology. This never happened in the history of late Soviet Union and the United States. If there was a clash, I mean domestic clash, between ideological principles and national political and economical interest, those national interests always were victorious in this clash. So I don't think there's an ideological clash between Russia and the US. There was some time ago, but it is no longer. And if we keep saying that, you know, we are bound to be warring, we are bound to be in conflict, then we will never resolve our differences. We have to say, look, we're not that different after all. This is not about ideology. We're not enemies. We can coexist. Thank you.
Thank you to the debaters. So now we have our final round of voting on the question, do Russia and the United States currently face an ideological clash? Please vote now.
Yes, you want, Chris?
I think with a diminished margin now.
No, you see, the vote is good.
What's interesting is how many, yes, I don't know what.
Okay, it looks like the voting has concluded. So before the debate, the vote was 14 yes to 9 no, and now it is 9 yes to 7 no, which actually means that there is less of a divide between the two positions. You can interpret this how you will. It's either a tie, or I would say you have managed to convince some people. So thank you to both of the debaters. Congratulations to you both. And I will turn it over to Laura for some final thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Eric, very much. I'm actually going to hand over to Victoria to say a couple of last words, and thank you for your time. So.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Eric. And first, I would like to thank all sides, thank the Fletcher School, thank REAC for hosting us, thank the audience and everyone who stayed with us, both in reality and online. I would like to say that each year we have different formats of Kortunov debates, and it was like an experiment to hold it on the international level and to, as well, to have it in a digital dimension, I can say, and first time it was in English. But I hope that people enjoyed, and I hope that, and I think really that this exchange of opinions and discussion was really constructive. Of course, there were times when we had very hard discussions and battles, I can say, but I think that is not the case, that we probably should have them, especially when we do not talk personally. And probably we can wish that one day we can meet each other personally, have those debates, and probably that will be better times in our relations as well. But anyway, I think that was a very good experience for all of us, and thanks again. And also would like to say our Moscow audience not to run away, because we have a small after party and snacks and drinks. So thank you very much, and let's hope for our further cooperation.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And if I may, just a few final words. It was really a pleasure to collaborate with the REAC and the creative diplomacy team for the Fletcher School. We are very pleased with the result. This was a bit of an experiment for you and for us because these video-linked debates are rather unique. One of the things we found is that we have many agreements in addition to our disagreements, but perhaps we can agree on more than we disagree. And these debates have been very insightful and enlightening, and I would like to express our gratitude to all of the participants and the discussants and the members of the audience who contributed to this discussion, and to wish everyone on the U.S. side as well as the Russian side happy holidays and Happy New Year.
С Новым годом.
С Новым годом.
С Новым годом.
Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Upload each other.